Greetings to people coming in. We'll start in a minute or two as people enter the room. We're very excited for the discussion ahead, so welcome. But we'll let people come into the room and get started in 1 or 2 minutes. Greetings to everybody. I'm Jeffrey Sachs. Welcome to Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. And I could not be more thrilled and honored to be speaking today with Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who's just published another fantastic book. She is a world-leading historian, and we're talking about her new book out just this week, Not a Nation of Immigrants, big capital not. So this is a book calling on us to rethink, reconceptualize American history, because certainly when I was growing up in the 1960s, and she explains why it was in that period, I was told all the time as I was growing up that we're a nation of immigrants. And that seemed somewhat natural to me because I myself come from a family that came from Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century. So I thought that was what America was. And this remarkable book, Roxanne, really calls for a fundamental rethink of America, that America is not a nation of immigrants, as you'll describe and we'll talk about. It's a nation of settlers, or settler colonialism, as you describe it, and that this is a very different perspective. And by the time one finishes the book, and I hope by the time we finish the hour, it also becomes clear that this is not only a matter of getting history right, it's a matter of understanding our immediate presence, even the crisis in Afghanistan, I would say, because it's a matter of America's role in the world as reflected in America's role on the North American continent. So welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. You know, I love your writing and love your books, and this one is spectacular. Can you talk about, for everybody just joining in, most who will run out and get your book afterwards, what is the theme, and why are we not in the United States a nation of immigrants, even if we're constantly told that we are?
Well, thank you, Jeff, so much for having me on your wonderful podcast. Yes, the theme is really about what the United States really is, a settler colonial state, founded as such from the initial settlements in Jamestown and Plymouth. That was the intention. It was kind of an extension of British settler colonialism in Ulster in Ireland, colonizing Ireland. So it was not a first time. They were very seasoned settler colonialists who came and took land from the existing people, pushed them to the peripheries. But that doesn't mean there aren't immigrants. There certainly are immigrants, but settler colonialists come to steal land, take land, move people out, and take that land themselves and settle it. Immigrants come to an already existing polity, an already existing society. They had nothing to do with creating it. They're either fleeing, they're refugees fleeing, like the Irish famine refugees in the 1840s. You could say they were the first immigrants. That's when immigration started, although they were refugees, and there is a difference. They were being pushed rather than choosing, making a choice. So settlers have already set everything up, and of course it's hundreds of years it's been set up. So generations of other settlers came after they kept coming, but they were still building what it was, those 13 colonies. And then they immediately, upon independence, started moving. The British were keeping them from moving over the mountain chain. So they were hugging the Atlantic coast, and they immediately started annexing and taking more land and needing more settlers. So up until the 1840s, everyone who came for land. They came for land, except, of course, enslaved Africans who were brought to do the work of that land. In part, the colonialism of the era was mostly around mining and taking resources in India and Mexico, Spanish colonialism. But for the British, it was agricultural production, particularly cotton and tobacco. Tobacco was indigenous to North America. It was a sacrament for the native people, highly addictive. So it spread all over Europe and was a major commodity. So these plantations that get formed and are worked by slave labor, they deplete the land, so they have to get more land. They move away from Virginia and of course into the Mississippi Valley. So up until 1860, that was the process of settler colonialism. So the first Immigration Act to exist at all, the United States, the Irish came. The Irish, they were problematic to the existing order. They were Catholics. They were a Protestant country, but they found a way of Americanizing by affiliating with the Democrats, the party of Andrew Jackson. They're a very racist party. They worked in slave patrols, and they worked in policing. The police were getting started at the time. So there was a certain Americanization. But the first Immigration Act was actually exclusion of Chinese in 1870.
That was the first Immigration Act.
Yeah, exclusion.
That's interesting. So could I just go back for one moment just to check the basic facts and to help people conceptualize the dates. The English start coming in the early 17th century, in the early 1600s. The first settlements, as you said, in Virginia, in Jamestown, and in Massachusetts, in Plymouth. And it's in the 17th century that these are settlers because, as you say, they're coming for land. They are coming for agriculture. And people should remember that it was only 150 years after that. That's when the colonies broke away from Britain, and they broke away, as you mentioned in passing, so that they could get more land. That the American Revolution was really because the British authorities in London were telling the settlers, the British settlers in the colonies, don't cross the Appalachian Mountains to the west. But they said, why not? We want more land. And broke free from the British control. And then, as you describe in the book, it's the Northwest Territories, so-called the Ohio Valley, to the west of Appalachia, that the settlers first move. Then you mentioned Andrew Jackson of the 1830s. We'll come back to him in a moment. He is, in my view, one of the racist criminals presidents of the United States. We've had a few, but he is involved in more land expansion and pushing Native Americans to the West. But then you mentioned in the 1840s what you're calling, and I think it's eye-opening, and I hope people are catching this important nuance, Roman Catholic Irish refugees from famine and from British imperialism in Ireland come to the Americas, but they're really the first immigrants coming to an established political system as workers. And they end up working in the army and in the police to enforce this settler system, is as you're describing it. Well, two groups that one you haven't, you mentioned in quick passing, but of course it's a central theme of America, and that is the slaves brought by millions to the Americas by the British, and the fact that when the settlers came, it wasn't an empty country. You haven't mentioned yet the indigenous population, so I'd like to ask you about that, just to get the picture filled out.
Yes, it's very important to understand that the mythology of the wandering Indian out in the woods hunting, not cultivating the land, which was a Puritan argument that they were actually sinful because they were not cultivating the land. But in fact, they were cultivating the land. The eastern part of North America, what is now the United States, was one of the 7 sites of the founding of agrarian civilizations, like the Nile and Euphrates and the Po River and the Mesoamerica and the Inca. There's 7 that are designated in the eastern North America, up to the subarctic, all the way to the Gulf, and from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. So this had been curated by these agrarian native nations. You know their names: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek, Muskogee people, and then many others, but those were the very large populations in the Southeast. So what the settlers did, they came to already cultivated land and appropriated it. The forests were curated. They burned the underbrush so that they made roads through the forest. That John Smith, the mercenary John Smith, wrote that he could take a buggy, horses and a buggy, all the way from Virginia to Massachusetts through the woods on the roads that were built, and how that meant a large army could easily use these roads to conquer the people. So generally people feel very sorry for Native people, but they think they were kind of half naked, kind of going out and hunting and eating. They all lived in villages. It was a continent of villages, basically. And they were self-subsistent, but they also did trade, but they didn't raise commercial crops. Tobacco was a wild. They did nurture it. It was but it was a sacred, it wasn't for massive use at all, as it became. The cotton was indigenous. They used cotton for clothing and so forth. So I think this was, to understand that it was colonialism appropriates what already exists. They don't come into a wilderness. There was no wilderness in North America. It didn't exist. That's an invention.
Yes. Well, one thing, Roxanne, that amazed me this year, because I hadn't ever focused on it, I think when I read John Locke as a student almost 50 years ago, we hail the philosopher John Locke, who wrote around 1690, the second treatise on government. And in Locke's writings in 1690, he talks about the right of private property, and he imagines private property coming from a person who works uninhabited land and makes it his own by adding his labor to it. Then he says, well, in the Americas, they use the land so badly that it is our right to take it, because if we increase the production from the land, it's not really like we're taking anything away from civilization. It's making a net gift to civilization. It's an extraordinary justification of colonialism by this hero of liberalism.
Right. Yeah, and it's completely made up because he had never even seen anything. Up in the French colonized territory, they were amazed that the Haudenosaunee, the corn that they raised, and they created silos. The silo came from for storage, and the women were all in charge. The distribution of food. They found tons and tons. They said they burned tons and tons of stored corn that they used through the winter. So it showed this not only that they were very productive, but they were, before capitalism, which John Locke was a major contributor to the ideological formation of. There was no such thing as private property, the land itself being a commodity to sell. And I think there's a relationship between the founding of private property as something that could be bought and sold, and the enslavement of human bodies that could be bought and sold. Because the land is sacred, just as the human body is. And once and it came together with the founding of capitalism and the looting of the Americas.
Well, it's interesting because it links the enclosure movements in England, which took customary land away and made it into private gentry, with the settler idea of taking native land away and making it into private ownership. Yeah, I had never made that link.
Yeah, and women were so important there too, with the commons in Europe and Britain, maintaining the commons. And that's the burning of the witches, the burning of the women who took care of the land. That was one way to, in Europe. Yeah, Europe really, it preceded, and it was repeated then in the Americas, and basically taking of the native commons in the Americas.
Roxanne, your book opens with a real myth buster, which was a little sad for me because it did break some myths that I held. And that is, the first chapter is about Alexander Hamilton, one of the wonderful Broadway plays of recent years. But I'd like you to describe this context, but let me just set the stage, as it were, a little bit, which is that the richest British colonies in the 18th century, I think it's right to say, were in the Caribbean, the sugar colonies, which were all slave colonies, and actually quite, of course, very ruthless slave colonies, and very profitable for the British slave owners and the sugar magnates. And out of that milieu comes Alexander Hamilton, but not in the way that I thought. So could you actually describe this, because it is setting the scene for what we don't understand properly about American history?
Yeah, U.S. historians, make up a lot of things about these so-called founders. And Chernoff, who wrote the Hamilton biography that Lin-Manuel Miranda created the musical from, he just told lies. That the idea that Alexander Hamilton was an immigrant. This is a Nation of Immigrants extravaganza. I never thought I would see. I was already on to the Nation of Immigrants thing. From 2005, I wrote a kind of rant about stop calling this a Nation of Immigrants, and giving my thesis. But that play came along, and I had this is the embodiment of that concept, and making Alexander Hamilton into an immigrant when he was a British citizen. They were a tiny minority in the Caribbean, whether they were French or British or anything else, because these were total slave colonies, the sugar colonies. This commodity of sugar. Everyone in the world got addicted to it, just like tobacco, and opium, these drugs that built the Western civilization. And and so Alexander Hamilton,
if you want to make money, if you want to make money, go into a business of addiction. You have your ready customers there.
Right, exactly. So he was white. That meant he was privileged. He was a British citizen, and although his parents died, he was taken care of. He was actually trained, taken as a we would call it an intern now, an apprentice in accounting. And what were the books about? What was being traded? Slaves. That was the only commodity. Slaves and sugar. Everyone was involved in the slave trade. So the idea was an abolitionist, an immigrant. It's just, absolutely ridiculous. He was sent by these wealthy men to Columbia University in the British colony of New York to go to college. He was not an immigrant. They could move around anywhere they wanted. They didn't have to have papers or anything else to move within the British Empire.
He was a subject of the British Empire. From
and
slave
that was totally privileged. That was a very privileged thing. So he was already well-to-do. He immediately married into the wealthiest family in New York, the Schuylers, who were also the biggest slave owners and slave traders in the North, in New York.
As you mentioned, that's the wonderful scenes on the play, but they don't mention that the Schuylers are a major slaver family.
They don't mention slaves at all, and they don't have characters that are slaves. I mean, it's this. The whole thing is this, really. The poet Ishmael Reed here in the Bay Area made a play where he's talking to Lin-Manuel about his fantasies. It's a wonderful one-act play that he put on in New York. Toni Morrison was still alive and sponsored it, and so he exposed a lot. But I think the other really kind of tragic thing about Lin-Manuel Miranda is he calls himself an immigrant. And he comes from Puerto Rico, which is a colony of the United States. So this fuzziness about who's a colonized person, who's a settler, who's an immigrant just gets, wiped out. And that's what the American story loves, is the new level of homogenization. So we don't have to deal with all of these, really complicated contradictions.
And you note that Hamilton was opposed to real immigrants coming to the United States.
Oh, he was terrified, especially of the French revolutionaries. The French Revolution, France, the monarchy supported the revolution, and then the French Revolution started, and by the time they were writing the Constitution, he was for the most rigid alien and sedition acts, and particularly to keep French, any French people out. He was the main spokesman for everyone having to be vetted, each and every person. But I think the other thing about Hamilton that people don't understand is he was first and foremost a military man. He was second only to George Washington in the command of the army. He's the one that led 15,000 troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. That was Alexander Hamilton that did that. George Washington was involved, and then he had second thoughts and went away. It was completely Alexander Hamilton's thing of crushing these peasants over this tax, on their whiskey they were making. They protested the tax, and they were being taxed, to pay for the military. So he's basically a military man, and he was the most important person in writing the Constitution in the the Federalists were Madison, but it was mainly Alexander Hamilton. He was I would say he was a brilliant evil genius. And what now, there's a lot of literature that has looked at the Constitution and come up with this term that's really borrowed from the development of Britain, the British state, is a fiscal military state. That is a state made for war. And I think that's really important to understand, that the United States has never seen a day in its existence from the time of the Revolution without war. You can't find a day when there wasn't war, aggressive war, not defensive war, aggressive war.
What struck me, Roxanne, about that, I've thought about that fact, how militarized our society is, and how British that fact is, because probably one could say there was hardly a day without war for Britain from maybe around 1400 onward. And then Britain just rolled across the whole world. There's a famous map, which I like, the 23 countries of the world that Britain never invaded, because British troops have been in roughly 170 countries of the world during this period. But the US is a British settlement, and it created a fiscal military state, because the US then had war as its central theme to create the territorial United States, to dispossess the Native American villages and nations across the country. But I had not made the connection with Hamilton. I think of Hamilton as, yes, creating a central government, creating the basis for industry and infrastructure, for manufacturing, but also creating the institutions to enable an ongoing military campaign, as it were, which continues around the world, of course.
He also created the first corporation during the fighting, the 10-year war, and it was for manufacturing armaments. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. It still exists. That's where all the guns are made. So we're a nation of gun manufacturing too. It's survived offshore none of them ever moved offshore. And it's a major export from, especially the war machinery, but small arms as well. The United States exports 60% of the world's small arms around the world, so, and domestically even more. So it's a very martial nation, and people don't think of themselves in the United States as a military state, and that's dangerous.
One of the many remarkable quotations you have in here is a statement by Thomas Jefferson, who ironically was Hamilton's foe. But in 1801, Jefferson says the following: however, our present interests may restrain us within our limits, it is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with the people speaking the same language, governed in similar form by similar laws. So 1801 and the very birth of the country, I thought it came later, but Jefferson is already saying we're going to spread out across the entire North American continent and the entire South American continent, for that matter. Right. Fortunately, there were no people there, right?
Yeah, and he put it into action. He sent military spies into what was then Spanish-held northern Mexico, and he sent to explore, and explore how to make war. And then the Monroe Doctrine in 1821, and then Texas taking the province of Texas, the slave owners taking Texas, and Mexico was independent and declared abolished slavery, so never accepted Texas so-called republic. Yep. But then the war that took half of Mexico, so definitely they were in the I think, just their main competitor, and why I think they weren't able to take all of Latin America and the Caribbean, was a British competitor. The British capital was also very important in controlling. But that more or less, they handed over, with the Monroe Doctrine, kind of handed over to the United States. Okay, that's your sphere of interest now. They just hung on to a few colonies.
The U.S. Conceives itself as a country of law, and somehow under that law comes all of this war, genocide, expropriation, enslavement. And one of the features of the law, which you have written about beautifully and talk about in this book, is this doctrine of discovery. And even the Supreme Court validating that. Could you describe that? Because it's really fascinating what comes under the quote rule of law.
Yeah, most people, I think, in the United States have no idea that one of the fundamental laws in the United States is based on a papal bull from 1493, which gave the Americas to Spain, to Castile and Aragon, after Columbus's voyage. That had been preceded by a papal bull that gave Portugal all of Africa. So that was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. So that doctrine of discovery then was adopted by other countries, even Protestant England, and all colonial powers started invoking it. And in the United States, it was.
What did it say exactly? I mean, from the context, say, of Protestant Britain, what is the doctrine of discovery exactly that you have the right to do?
You have the right of possession if you discover it, discover another territory without, that is terra nullius. And terra nullius is, what that means is that the humans that are there are not considered people who have the knowledge of land, even though they're farmers. Throughout the Americas, they're farmers. Throughout Africa, they're farmers and herders. They're fishermen. They're human beings living quite well, actually, and living longer than Europeans because they take baths, and when Europeans didn't, so that disappearance of any people who were not Christian. See, it's a Christian doctrine. So if they're not Christian, they're not human. And you can take their land, or you take their land and then Christianize them. And then maybe they can be, for the Spanish, worked into, absorbed, but they're not in charge. So the way the US adopted it, Thomas Jefferson actually stated, it wasn't law, but he stated that it's just built into the Constitution of the United States, and the reality that the doctrine of discovery applies to the United States, that they possess it by the right of discovery. And then it was in the Marshall decisions about the Cherokees.
In the Supreme Court, no less.
In the Supreme Court, yeah. So it entered into law in the Supreme Court. It was most recently validated by the Supreme Court in 2007 in a land case of, in a land case of the Oneida, part of the Haudenosaunee. It was a clear-cut case of, really a very clear-cut case of Oneida land that should have been restored to them. And it was a Scalia court, but it was a unanimous decision to deny that, based specifically on the doctrine of discovery, naming it. And you know who wrote that opinion? Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
No.
Yes.
Wow. Based on Marshall's precedent, in a way?
Yes, and based on the doctrine of discovery being law. And what she was saying, and it's really kind of scary, is that all of native claimed land in North America then could be taken away. It's a horrible precedent. If anyone wanted to use it, it's
it's extraordinary, Roxanne. One of the very deep reflections, we have come to know much better that an original sin of the United States, a profound and deep one, is enslavement, and for that reason, the Dred Scott case in 1857, which said that a slave could not be a citizen of the United States, but was just chattel, and that this was obvious, is so incredibly shocking. And of course, it was one of the steps on the way to the Civil War itself. But your book is all on the theme that there are really two interrelated original sins. Even the other might be more fundamental, and that is the colonial settler taking what doesn't belong to you by dispossessing or committing genocide against native populations, native peoples who were here before. And there's a great line, I think it's quoting my colleague Mahmoud Mamdani, saying that American history is to some extent being deracialized, but not yet decolonized. So that there's one part is being faced, although with all of the incredible turmoil around that, but the colonial part is not being understood. And I just reflect that while we know the Dred Scott decision, I kind of knew about the doctrine of discovery, but still I was shocked to read the Marshall opinion. And I didn't know what you just said about the Ruth Bader Ginsburg for a unanimous court renewing it. So this part of history is still not, this is of course the theme of your book, which is that maybe we're coming to grips with some dimensions of what really happened, but we're not coming to grips with this other absolutely fundamental reality, which is that this was a place conquered nonstop, relentlessly from other people. And that is a very, very different vision of what our history is.
Yeah, it's also that the two are really inseparable. They're wrapped together. The enslavement of Africans and slave labor and the land being taken. You know, historically, you can't really separate those. That's why almost every history book text that's written is very partial history and therefore distorted. The wonderful historian Eric Foner, who's done so much good work on abolitionism and slavery, I mean, just the monumental work, which I treasure, has never been able to put these two. I don't think he's really tried to put
I'll
them
ask him
together.
about that because Roxanne, I'm going to be speaking with him about his new book, The Second Founding, soon. So I will put the issue to him.
Ask him. Yeah, and ask him what was going on in the Civil War in Minnesota and the Southwest. You know, with the war against the Dakotas and the mass hanging, and the Sand Creek Massacre, and the long walk of the incarceration of the Navajos. What does that have to do with it? You know, how did Lincoln take time for all of those still fighting Indians, you know, so that's not included, you know, in civil text on the Civil War. And I think it's because historians can't, because the basic framework of doing US history is almost like it's written in stone. And you can only, you know, a few rocks fall off the stone and you kind of rearrange them. And as civil rights comes up, you got to lift up and look underneath. But it doesn't include genocide. It doesn't include, you know, ethnic cleansing, genocide, how the land was taken, how it got transferred from 500 nations in the continent to white people, basically Europeans, own most of the land still today is in the hands of descendants of the original settlers. So, and a whole government built around that. But, you know, back to a Nation of Immigrants, I think one of the reasons I wanted to write this book and break that down and demystify it is because it's one of the main modern, you know, post-World War II curtains that have been created to camouflage the history of settler colonialism and genocide. And you know, it was created, it's not old. John F. Kennedy created that term, a nation of immigrants. He published a book in 1958 when he was senator. And I'm pretty sure it was a kind of propaganda book for him running as a Catholic and a son of immigrants. Mm-hmm. Because up to that time, every single president had been either an original settler or a descendant of original settlers, either Anglo
Almost
or
all,
Scots.
or basically all British Protestant descent.
Anglo, yeah, Scots Anglo, Scots Irish, or the colonizers of Ulster, or Anglo,
Mhm.
or Anglo Scots, or Anglo Brits. And up until John F. Kennedy ran. So I think he was trying to show that immigrants were good. And it's mostly about the Irish famine, refugees and immigrants. It doesn't include, never mentions the border or Mexico, which you would think a book on. At that time, Operation Wetback was going on, which he had to vote for in Congress, the deportation of 2 million
Forcibly removing
Mexican workers.
Mexico. Yeah.
Right. So I think that it was created and it was picked up, and then it made its way into textbooks and all. And now it's just, it is literally the world slogan for the United States, that's a nation of immigrants. And it's a big lie that, does make people want to come to the United States. Oh, there's a place where I can be totally accepted, people who are, but I think most people have come as immigrants for jobs because it's an economic powerhouse. And I'm sure that was true of your ancestors who came, the Eastern Europeans.
They were running away from the Tsar, who
from pogroms, and
exactly.
a lot of the Germans who came were socialists who were running away from persecution as socialists, and that's why we had a moment of socialist organizing in the late 19th century. Even where I came from in Oklahoma, it was mainly German socialist immigrants.
I didn't realize that.
Organizing. I mean, my grandfather was involved. He was just an old Scots-Irish settler guy, but they were mostly German socialists, many of them Catholic too. Yeah, so immigrants have come for various, political reasons, but also fleeing just poverty, like the Sicilians who came, the Southern Europeans, tenant farmers, starving, needing remittances to send back to their families, basically to work. But the whole idea that it's a beacon, and the Statue of Liberty and all that, it's been very cruel to, I mentioned the exclusion of Chinese. The second immigration law was to extend that to all Asians. And the third big one was,
is that right? Or sometime,
and then
1917.
And then 1923, only Western Europeans, and strict quotas on everyone else. And one of the outcomes of that, tragic outcomes, and I think the United States is responsible for a lot of deaths of Jewish refugees trying to escape. The United States had a strict quota on Eastern Europeans and could only they took fewer Jewish refugees than Cuba and Mexico, poor countries.
Wow.
Yes. So that was and they also picked and chose, intellectuals and nuclear scientists, who they would bring, not the poor suffering masses, but so that it has consequences. It has tragic consequences, this exclusion.
Roxanne, you've been campaigning for the truth and for advocacy of expanding the understanding and the narrative of America for a long time. And now we're in the midst of the history wars, which are extraordinary, but showing how touching on these issues is so fraught with with
Yeah.
political division. Even Mitch McConnell, one of my least favorite politicians in the world, writing to the Secretary of Education, don't teach this stuff. It divides us, as if the truth should be suppressed so that the white settler slave owning narrative would be the only truth that was told in America. Are we making progress? You've been watching this for a long time and leading. Is there a change as America itself changes demographically, as we have voices coming from indigenous historians, of course, African-American historians, telling the history from the perspective of those who suffered this fate?
Yeah, I think that definitely the horse is out of the gate for truth. That it can't be stuffed back in. You know, it just it's out there, and I credit the civil rights movement, and you know that of course it started a long time ago with early in the 20th century, but really picked up after World War II, and then that spawned you know the Red Power movement, the Chicano, Mexican, Puerto Rican women's liberation, LGBTQ and trans. That liberation is very, very hard to. It would take very strong repression that the United States is not prepared for. They've mainly used drugs, sex and rock and roll, and you know diversions, films and all to keep us all pacified.
And as you mentioned, mass incarceration.
And if you rebel, mass incarceration, you know, and other, you know, and actual sometimes killing people. So that has worked pretty well for a long time, but I think they really don't know who they're dealing with. Even in very remote places, people like me, you probably also hear from people in small towns, in rural areas, and parts of the country. Everywhere you go, there is at least 5 or 6 people, if not a dozen or 2 dozen, who are dissidents to this right-wing stuff that's all around them. And they're fighting it in various ways. And so it's, I think the pandemic, I've gotten a little pessimistic because I get I recharge going out and talking in places like this and realizing they're there, but it's hard when you're just watching the screen and reading the news feeds to see what's really out there, what's going on. Because I think, you know, truth and beauty and looking to the future as being better is something addictive, you know, in a good way that is hard to suppress, especially in young people, because they want to see a future and they don't want to see armed goons spouting racist things on Capitol steps everywhere or in the nation's capital. That's not the future they want to see. And so I do think that I say, bring it on, you know, this attack on history, because this is our opening to tell the real story, you know. Critical race theory was a very obscure thing until they brought it up, and now everyone's buying all these books and wanting to learn.
Well, you have launched a critical imperial theory or critical colonial theory with this book. And Roxanne, I was I was really floored by the last sentence of the book. It's not a spoiler alert because I want everyone to read all the richness that comes up to this. But for me, I watch foreign policy a lot. I watch the United States from outside the United States a lot. It's stunning to me how militarized American foreign policy is on almost anything. The first resort is a military resort. If you can't do a military resort, is crush them with sanctions, but crush them. Be sure to crush them. So this is how our foreign policy works. And I just want to read the last sentence of the book, which is fantastic. It says, the United States will not decolonize until it is forced to do so. And unless colonization and imperialism are understood to be inherent in the very founding and all US institutions, we cannot begin to dismantle the fiscal military state. And this is really makes clear we're not arguing about the truth of history. We're arguing about the nature of America here. And you're talking about how to make a country that is not obsessed with conquest. Because after a long time, after, as you say, a country that has been in a conflict every day since its founding, this is certainly the tonic that we need.
Yes, and I know you do a lot of work on China and the ridiculous war making that the U.S. is. I'm just so afraid this pulling out from Afghanistan is what they're saying it is. We have to pay attention to China. They say the same thing Obama said. We have to pivot to China, and this is one of the most important chapters.
You might think it could be a pivot to peace, right? But no,
right.
It could be a pivot to the next conflict.
But the yellow peril thing goes back to Marco Polo saying, those people are really organized. There's so many of them. They have roads and everything. They could take us over. They can overwhelm us. There's been this paranoia, and then it got named in the 19th century as the yellow peril that we have to be afraid of. And the whole trade union movement in the United States was corrupted by anti-Chinese bigotry. Jack London and famous people, absolute bigots. And so I think we have to really, really support our our Chinese American scholars and activists who are doing amazing work. A new book out by Mag Ngai, Ngai, is a very important book. Viet Nguyen's books, of course, Nothing Ever Dies, a Vietnamese writer, and his wonderful novels. Everyone should be reading this stuff and understanding that we must stop this war making, take those warships out of the South China Sea.
Roxanne, that is a wonderful place for us to end a fantastic discussion. But let me say thank you for helping shine the light on historical truth to help us to understand our predicament today, and especially a kind of national addiction to militarism. But as you say, in the history, we were founded as a fiscal military state, and it's quite an eye-opening notion and idea, and an extraordinarily powerful book. So let me again, please encourage everybody listening to read Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's wonderful new study, Not a Nation of Immigrants. So powerful. Thank you so much for being together in conversation with me today. I'm always so delighted to speak with you and so honored to speak with you. Next month, we will continue on related themes. On Monday, September 13 at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we'll have my wonderful dear colleague, Professor Eric Foner of Columbia University, talking about his fantastic new book, The Second Founding. So please join us in a month. thank you again for everybody being together, and please stay safe, stay well, and we'll be together with you next month, September 13th, 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.